I'm Marty Levinson, and you're watching Northtown News Magazine.
Hi, he's Marty Levinson. Welcome to the Northtown News Magazine.
Hi, I'm Marty Levinson. Welcome to the Northtown News Magazine.
For the identity of the real Marty Levinson, please stay tuned for the Northtown News Magazine.
Come on, baby, don't you wanna go? Come on.
Hi, I'm Marty Levinson. Welcome to the Northtown News Magazine show with the greatest cameraman around, Sonny Hirsch, and your host, Avi Myers. Thank you, Marty. Avi Myers, Northtown Neighborhood News Magazine, a presentation of Sonny Hirsch and myself. Dial us up on the web at www.ntnm.org. Where close to 250,000 of you have watched shows. And if the counter on YouTube actually worked all the time, it'd probably be more like about 400,000, but whatever. Community policing is alive and well in the 24th District. You know, this is not a matter of being a law and order guy or whatever. This is a simple deal where if you see something happening that's wrong, you probably should tell the police about it, you know, especially if it's against the law. And community policing is about the police and the community having a conversation face to face, getting to know each other, understanding the police aren't quite the boogeymen, and the police understanding you're not quite the aliens. But the fact is, if you want to catch the bad guys and you know what's going on, the cops are the right people to tell. And you know, you really don't want bad guys in your neighborhood. About once a year these days, it is a pleasure to have one of the brightest minds we've ever had. Well, maybe the brightest. And actually, as much sleep as I got last night, I'm certainly not one of them today. I mean, maybe my bulb's a little dim. We're talking about the only person who ever gave Jan Schakowsky fits when he ran against her, which was wonderful, and the editor-in-chief of Breitbart.com. And even if you don't agree with them, it's about the only honest news site around, because they don't kid around about, you know, where they're coming from. And that is something to respect and admire. And of course, we're talking about Joe Pollak. Joe, how you doing?
Good to be with you again.
First of all, my pleasure. How's life in California, in Santa Monica?
It's great. Oh, beautiful, terrific, wonderful.
Yeah.
You know, my wife's doing her PhD program out there, and our daughter is thriving there, so we're very happy.
And your daughter's like 1 whole year old right now?
Yeah, she's 14 months and taking her first steps and talking all the time, and sits by herself sometimes and reads. She loves books, so she's great. A lot of fun, a lot of joy.
Well, as they say in French, may you have tremendous amounts of Yiddish anakas from her in your future ones.
Yeah, thank you.
So tell me about Breitbart.
Well,
and for those people who are not familiar with Breitbart because they're too busy watching the liberal media, you know, you should introduce people a little bit.
Well, Breitbart.com is Breitbart news outlet, and it was started by Andrew Breitbart back in 2009 as the Big Hollywood blog. He started out blogging about pop culture from two aspects. One was the coming out of conservatives in Hollywood, and there weren't many before Andrew got them going. And two is a critical look at Hollywood and the cultural products it puts out there from a conservative perspective. So after Big Hollywood came Big Government. With the launch of Big Government were the famous Acorn tapes and the takedown of Acorn. Following that was Big Journalism, and then Big Peace, our foreign affairs site. So there were the four bigs. And then Andrew's plan was to consolidate the four bigs under one roof, under Breitbart.com, which was going to be a 24-hour news cycle, news website, not just a blog website. And that launched last March. It launched, sadly, a few days after Andrew passed away. It had always been in the cards to launch at the beginning of March, and then he died suddenly on March 1st. So we went ahead with the launch anyway. We fulfilled his vision for the site, and now we're a 24-hour news service. And you can get all the news from a conservative perspective, whether on government, the media. Now we've just added Breitbart Sports as well, so we have sports covering everything that's going on, and looking sometimes at the politics of the sports world, particularly the sports media world, ESPN and so on, which often does take a position on certain controversial issues. And
yeah, I stopped reading Rick Riley.
Yeah. Well, you know, certainly around the Super Bowl, there was a lot of discussion about the gay marriage debate. There were players on either team that had different views on it, and certainly the ESPN coverage was pushing it in one direction, ignoring proponents of traditional marriage like future Hall of Fame center Matt Burke, who I actually went to college with. He was a year ahead of me. and he was very unapologetic about his support for traditional marriage. You know, he played center for the Vikings for over 10 years, and then he was let go, and the Ravens picked him up, and he got to the Super Bowl. But he was very forward about his traditional beliefs from a Christian perspective. That got ignored because of the more prominent, and I guess from ESPN's point of view, more politically correct views of another one of his teammates. And, you know, without taking a side on either side of that issue, you can look at the media coverage and say, well, they're not really covering the debate. They're just basically pushing a view. So that was one way in which we highlighted some of the politics involved in the sports world and the sports media world, just one example. But we do all that on Breitbart. We've also got the news wires if you just want to check us for daily news as it comes hot off the press from AP and other agencies. You can read it on Breitbart. You don't have to go to another website to do it. So we've been very successful. We had a huge increase in traffic over the years since we started. We've grown. We're really the brand name right now in conservative news. That was clear to me in March at CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference, where you really wanted to hang out with Breitbart News if you wanted to hang out with people. And that's the way it always was when Andrew was around. And of course, nobody threw a party like Andrew Breitbart, but we really brought the party again to CPAC this year, and we do every day online. We take our jobs very seriously. We don't take ourselves that seriously. And we're a place, I think, for conservatives to find a debate that is honest about differences within the conservative movement about various different issues, but at the same time is also very forthright about taking on the left establishment, particularly the liberal media, and the institutional left, as Andrew used to call it, the whole superstructure that exists to promote left-wing causes outside of the Democratic Party and outside of the media, but the institutions they've built through the generous contributions of George Soros and so forth.
Nazi, by the way, let's emphasize Nazi collaborator George Soros, who is the...
There's some doubt of a bit of an apocryphal story. I mean, he disputes that...
there was a 60-minute interview where he actually did help round up money from Jews with the Nazis. So
he was a kid, so he was... I'm not so sure how aware he was of what he was doing.
It sounds like he was past bar mitzvah age, but he still doesn't apologize for it. I mean, in Jewish life, once you're past bar mitzvah, your sins are your own.
I have trouble judging anyone from that time, except in very clear cases, because I think people did things to survive. We might not think that they're honorable necessarily, but there are stories that I think would test the moral boundaries that any of us have in everyday life.
No question it would test certain boundaries.
Yeah.
But I will tell you that
I'm not defending him. I'm just saying, it's not as easy to write him off for that reason. There's lots of other good reasons to write him off, in my view.
I'm basically named after my grandfather and my uncle, my grandfather in particular, who went to South Africa, where you were born, as a matter of fact, to avoid the Russian draft. And the Russian draft was basically being pulled out of bed in the middle of the night.
Right.
And you served 10 years in Siberia. After experiencing non-religious life in South Africa and understanding what he would face when he came to America, he chose to die in Europe rather than expose his family to the non-religious life. So I'm not saying that he's the rule. He's certainly not the rule. I don't expect people to necessarily willingly give up their life, though I'm honored to be named after him and my uncle, who felt that strongly about their Judaism. But, there's different levels. But you know what? I want to get to a couple of the things because you brought up so many topics. The gay thing is something that I've always kind of shied away from on the show. And Charles Krauthammer really had a brilliant column. Well, first of all, he can't help but have a brilliant column, even if I don't agree with him, the guy's brilliant. Okay, and people don't even realize that he was actually a Mondale Democrat in the mid-'80s.
Yes, he was. A speechwriter for Mondale.
That's correct, yeah. And by the way, I ran as a Gene McCarthy delegate, in 1972. But Gene McCarthy never considered himself a liberal, which is something people never understood. He was all in favor of gun control. He was so against, a volunteer army. And one of the best points I've ever heard made was done by our commander here, James Russo, is do you think if we didn't have an all-volunteer army, we would have stayed in Afghanistan and Iraq for as long as we have?
It's a fair point.
People never would have tolerated it. Plus, you can build up a military elite. But anyway, getting to the point, what Krauthammer wrote basically is, and I am with him all the way in talking about how I certainly not only know a lot of gay people, there's a ton of people like that who are on the show running for office. And I've never, ever, unless they openly come out with it, made a point of writing anything about it in the paper, because whatever people do in their bedroom should stay in their bedroom. And frankly, I wish it still was there. I really don't need to read about a man and a woman getting laid, let alone a man and a man or a woman and a woman. You know, I don't need to hear about that. It's not my business. If I'm not getting laid, I don't want to know. So in any event, what he basically said is, look, you know, this country is a sympathetic country in a lot of ways. And people have sympathy for these people, and they would like to have this, and wouldn't it be a nice thing? But by the same token, if you really do believe in the Bible, you know, and as a Jewish person, yeah, you know what? Moses really got the Bible from God. And that Bible really says, don't, when it comes to that. So the thing is, it's one thing to have all the sympathy in the world, and you have to think that to a large extent, we're a very nice nation. I mean, if you were in an Arab country doing that stuff, you'd be executed.
Well, there's two issues here. I mean, one is the issue of whether the broader public is prepared to accept or tolerate gay lifestyles, which I think is the motivating issue for a lot of gay activists who've put this out there. The other issue, and the issue that actually brings it before the court, is government policy. Specifically, I think in one of the cases, a widow who survived the death of her wife, they had a marriage that was done in Canada before it was legal here, was hit with a huge tax bill, estate taxes, that she would have been exempted from under ordinary marriage law. So the actual fundamental issue is government taxation in that case. Or let's take the argument for marital benefits. That's one of the arguments that gay couples are making, why they should be treated the same as opposite-sex couples, because, you know, if you have a partner who dies, you want to collect benefits or visitation rights in the hospital and so forth. So much of what we do is now mediated through government, whether it's taxes or spending. That's actually the issue that puts this before the courts in a more direct and immediate way.
Which, by the way, as we film in the middle of Pesach, it is before the Supreme Court right now.
Right, and it still will be when this airs, because they're not going to come down with a decision until June. But what conservatives, I think, ought to be looking at more is, why have we allowed government to come into so much of our lives that it becomes an argument about traditional values to talk about government benefits for married couples. And I think that's really an indication of where we are as a society, as much as the other part of the equation, which is the tolerance of society towards same-sex lifestyles and same-sex activities.
Yeah, there's no reason you shouldn't be totally tolerant. And
right.
You know what? I'm not going to criticize these people. It's their lives. They're entitled to do. And see, that's your point, and that's why I like what you're saying. It's their lives. They're entitled to do whatever it is they want to do. The trouble is, the government doesn't want to let me do whatever I want to do, even if it doesn't hurt anybody. And this very second, I could be violating 47 laws I'm not even aware of.
Well, the other issue is how this is being done. You know, we saw with Roe versus Wade in the abortion issue that 13 states, basically, by the time Roe versus Wade had been ruled on, 13 states, I believe, had legalized abortion in some way. And then the court stepped in and applied that rule across all the states, and then fueled this cultural war that had been building and divided the country for 4 decades. We've been divided over abortion for 40 years.
And you know what?
Because of this judicial decision. Whereas now you've got a process going on similar to that, where the states are deciding one by one whether they want to redefine marriage. Most have not. Very recently, some have. In fact, in the 2012 election, there were 4 that made that decision on the ballot, not in a courtroom. And that's how the debate should play out. People should have this debate. You know, society has to decide what marriage is and what it isn't. And if the definition of marriage changes because society decides its values change, that's okay. We can have different views on that in different states. I think where we run into trouble, and particularly the gay activist community runs into trouble, is where they've taken the fight to the courts and have asked the courts to overturn, in the case of California, overturn the decision of the electorate to stand up for traditional marriage, saying, well, we don't like what the electorate decided, even though we originally brought this referendum. We're going to use the court to overturn it. And that's, I think, where you're getting into trouble, because if the Supreme Court wades in and says, we are now applying same-sex marriage across all 50 states, you're going to see a cultural war that makes Roe versus Wade look tame by comparison. And I think that's one reason the court might step back and say, look, we have to learn our lesson from history. We don't want to get involved in the middle of a debate that's ongoing, that's social and cultural in nature. And I think you saw a little bit of that reluctance in the oral arguments at the Supreme Court. But again, the issue that brings it before the court is not what the definition of marriage should be. It really is about this issue of benefits, whether federal benefits in the case of the Defense of Marriage Act or state benefits. And that comes up only because we've allowed government to become so much a part of our lives, to direct so many of our policies economically and otherwise. So I think from a conservative point of view, maybe it's time to take a look at the structure of government benefits and the way our lives are so intertwined with the state that it becomes impossible to think about making a choice between traditional marriage or same-sex marriage without thinking about the role of government. And that's something I think we need to do more of, instead of getting caught up solely in the cultural argument, which we can't resolve any easier in the political arena than the left can.
You know what, I agree with you 100%. First of all, the idea of states' rights, and the fact is, you know what, like if I was starting out today, there's no way in hell I'd want to start a family in Illinois or start a business in Illinois. I'd move to a state where business is doing better rather than one fouled up here. And the same thing with marriage. You know what? If like I've got friends like Sonny, for instance, talks about the morons out in somewhere in a Northwest state. Okay, he's not alone in thinking things like that. But the fact of the matter is, you know what? It's like, well, first of all, you haven't met those people, but you know what? To certain people, that's the right place to be. To other people, maybe New York City or California is the place to be. I mean, and by the way, if I forgot to mention, Lori Diversey or Lisha Chiasm, who are big fans of Joel, I want to say hi because they mention you all the time, and I want to say that on the air, and you've got a big fan club here. But you know what? On top of that too, when it comes to the gay rights thing, it's like, people should be able. Yeah, you know what? If it's okay in Iowa, fine, go to Iowa. If it's okay in Illinois, fine, go to Illinois. If you don't like where you are, it's like this was never meant to be a homogeneous nation. The idea is that like freedom. And by the way, actually, the point I wanted to make, and I'm a little tired from all the satyrs, but the point I really wanted to make, which I'm losing right now, so I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Well, the left's argument against that is to say, well, if this is a violation of human rights, which is how they've defined it, you can't tolerate it in any state.
Oh, Ron the Intolerant. I'm sorry. I'm just going to interrupt you shortly so I remember. Yeah. You know what? I really try to ignore the gay argument in marriage to a certain extent because I know there's nothing I can do about it. But when Chick-fil-A wanted to, is very much a pro-marriage Christian type organization,
closed on Sundays,
opened up a restaurant here. Besides for the local alderman, Ron the Intolerant, as I like to call him, who is the czar of Chicago right now, basically said we don't want anybody who thinks like that to be, they don't think like we do. We don't want them in Chicago. That's as intolerant as you can possibly get. It used to be when I was growing up that the right was more intolerant. Now
right, and he met with Louis Farrakhan the next day, who is not only intolerant in general, but specifically intolerant of gay marriage. I mean, that was the joke really about what he said.
And an open Jew hater.
Right, and so you're going to meet with that guy, but you're not going to let Chick-fil-A into the city. I mean, it's ridiculous. And yes, we do see a lot more intolerance on the left, I think, today than you do on the right. But just to address that point, I mean, their argument is this is a human rights issue, so you can't tolerate its violation in any state. Which, by the way, is the same as the conservative argument on abortion, which is if you consider a fetus to be a child, then you can't tolerate the termination of that child, the murder of that child in any state. So there are arguments against states' rights on both the left and the right.
I just want to mention about abortion real quick because I always thought I had a very good solution to the issue, which which pisses off both sides, which is one of the reasons I think it's a good solution. And even Joe Biden 4 years ago basically adopted the same idea. And that is, the simple thing, because I don't think the government should be stepping into people's lives that way. I don't think the government should ever say, even though personally I don't think abortion is right, it doesn't mean that I'm going to stop somebody from doing whatever it is they want, because there is a freedom. But by the same token, you have to give, and if you're going to get, you also have to give. So the government should not only not have any part in abortion or tell people what to do, but they also should not pay for it, because it's not really fair to people who do believe that abortion is not. Now, Jewish belief is not quite the same as Christian belief, but neither one thinks it's right. But the fact is, it's basically from a religious standpoint wrong. So you know what? You just don't fund it. Okay? If the government stays out means you don't legislate it, you don't fund it. Just stay out of it. like the government should do in most areas in life.
Right, and when you suggest that the argument from the other side is, well, what are poor women who need abortions going to do? And the counter argument to that is, well, raise money for that. I mean, there are people who raise money for all kinds of privately raise money for all kinds of causes, and that's,
as I'm sure you're aware, studies have basically shown that one of the problems with the left is that they don't give anywhere near as much charity as the right does. The average person on the right is gives a much higher percentage of their income to charity. And frankly, as a Jewish person, I believe in at least tithing, giving 10% of my income to proper charities.
I'm not quite there yet. I certainly aspire to that, but I think that...
Well, by the way, I don't make that much money, so it's really easy for me.
I mean, we give charity, we try to do that. But I think in general there is a breakdown statistically that shows, yes, conservative Americans give more to charity.
And actually, it's been repeated over the years, over the last 10 years. There's no survey in the last 10 years that's shown that the left gives more than the right. And yeah, you know what? Exactly the point. If you want to do it, you know what? If these people are willing to spend like $1 billion to elect a president, how about taking a couple bucks out and helping these women get abortions?
Right. And it goes back to the point that I started with, which is that the real issue is how big a role government is playing in our lives, and government, in a sense, is displacing parents. So all of the changes we're talking about here, whether it's changes in marriage or abortion, they're not the cause of the breakdown of the family, but they're coterminous with the breakdown of the family. The breakdown of the family that's happened over the last 40 years, essentially, since the 1960s and onwards. And if you look at the economic differences, for example, among racial groups, almost all of the difference, in some cases, is accounted for by difference in family structure. For example, the fact that there's such a high rate of single parenthood in the black community, particularly the absence of fathers. More than discrimination, far more than discrimination, that's a cause of economic dislocation in the black community.
The next time you're here, one of the things I'd love to talk about, and frankly we could talk for probably 4 hours, but we don't have that much time, is that there is not a single honest discussion going on anywhere about what's really happening, whether it be the black community or so many other areas.
There's other communities as well. I mean, there's the other evidence, and there's great new research out about this, but essentially among white Americans, it's only the elite now that are maintaining intact families. In other words, a family has become sort of a luxury good. A lot of other people further down the socioeconomic chain are experiencing the same kind of marital breakups, family problems, and that sort of thing.
Well,
and it's become
more
a general
me society rather than understanding you're trying to join somebody for the greater good.
Right. What's ironic is that some of the people who said me the loudest and became the most successful are now past that and can now afford to form these more stable relationships. I mean, where I live in Santa Monica, it's a very wealthy community. We're not wealthy members of it, but our neighbors are certainly very wealthy, and I see more families there with small kids than I've seen in just about any other place I've lived. Outside of Skokie, of course, we see lots of families with small kids, but you see the families there, and you realize this is what they're talking about. I mean, these are families who have both parents with a college education, and everybody's earning enough money to live here, and they're raising kids and they're with their kids, whereas in other parts of LA where people aren't earning as much and aren't doing as well, that's where you start to see the struggles of families that aren't living that traditional lifestyle. And it's funny, but the liberal elite is opting for traditional lifestyles. The same-sex marriage movement is kind of like that. I mean, there have been some gay activists who sort of reflecting on all this have said, well, we're kind of going mainstream and kind of conservative in a way by advocating for same-sex marriage, because in a sense, the gay subculture was kind of a counterculture for a long time, was opposed to marriage, was opposed to traditional values of any kind. Now it's kind of gone mainstream, and certainly the elite activist community has taken it in that direction. So you're starting to see the elites of the country come back to the family model that was rejected in a way in the late 60s, early 70s. But the rest of the country, having been led in that direction of dissolution, is not coming back, is not able to come back. And partly it's a financial thing, and you see it even in the Jewish community. I mean, people, I see Facebook debates all the time among friends who complain that, when they're going to a wedding in the Orthodox community, they're looked down on if they don't have the sushi, and they don't have the hors d'oeuvres, and they don't have the fancy flowers at the chuppah. There's a kind of, there's a lot of pressure around these family things, and people without the means to put on that kind of display may feel intimidated and may even delay marriage for that reason. So,
by the way, that's for real.
Yeah.
But by the same token, I'll also tell you, like my niece, who basically supports her husband and 7 kids through work she does that doesn't put her anywhere above the poverty level. She has 7 kids. They don't have anything, but they're happy.
Right. Right. Well, there are ways to do it, and unfortunately, we have not put that trust in the next generation of individuals to find a way to do it. You know, someone said to me, "You're opposed to Obamacare, but what do you do about the person who doesn't have health insurance and is working a job that doesn't pay them enough to buy health insurance, but they're earning enough they can't afford the state programs for health insurance?" And I said, well, what about food? I mean, what do I do about the fact that person may not be able to feed their family? Should food be a right that the government guarantees? And she said, well, yeah, maybe it should be. And I said, you know, that's the problem, is that the challenge of going out there and putting bread on the table every day is a problem that human civilization has not yet been able to solve. We have no system that is able to provide for everybody in this way that doesn't require somebody to go out and take risks the next day and not know that they're going to succeed the next day. The challenge of living and making a living is something that we can't solve, and if we pretend we've solved it, we're going to end up like the communist countries, basically solving it in theory and never in practice. And
the practical end of that is that basically the whole society goes downhill as a result.
Exactly. And look, it's our destiny in a sense as human beings. That's also from the Bible. You know, it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard.
Yeah, b'zeis apecha tochal lechem, which means, you know, when God told Adam, by the sweat of your brow,
Right.
you will get your bread. The fact is, it's supposed to be hard. You know, you don't grow as a person if you don't rise to a challenge.
Right.
You know, if you rise to a challenge, when the challenge is out in front of you, you rise to it. It's like if you're handed everything, you're going to wind up being a 6-year-old your whole life. It doesn't work that way.
It's not always clear how to overcome some of the challenges. I mean, a lot of families have gone through a lot of hardship over the last few years. A lot of people still unemployed or out of work.
My business went to hell when the real estate market went. My business was the real estate market.
Right. And it's not always clear how you're going to make it through.
Yeah.
But the challenge of having to make it through, I think, does require
It does, working hard, and frankly, having faith in God, which by the way is another topic for another day, because frankly, I think the biggest thing that's wrong with this country is just too many people don't believe in God. There was a recent column by Dana Milbank in the Washington Post that in the 1950s, only 2% of people considered themselves atheists or agnostic. That number is up to 20% right now, which is, and it wasn't Dana Milbank, I'm sorry, I think it was Michael Gerson. That figure is now up to 20%, which is the second highest rate of any religious group, only behind Catholics or Protestants. I'm sorry.
Well, something else we've lost is the sense of earned success. Arthur Brooks at the American Enterprise Institute said that the most important positive reinforcement a human being can have is the idea that they've earned their success. And what our government programs do is they deny that to people. They deny people the idea that they've earned their success. And even people who've become successful out of difficult circumstances will say, well, I owe my success to this program or to affirmative action or to this welfare system. I mean, just picking on Tammy Duckworth, for example, when she was running for Congress, said all the time.
Please do. I wouldn't even pick her nose.
Well, she said the reason she was a Democrat, even though she had been in the military and had a conservative family, was because she felt that the government programs had put her where she ought to be. And you know, that's a kind of a debilitating thing, I think, for a lot of people. And I think she has the luxury of saying that because she did earn her success. She certainly earned her Purple Heart.
No question.
You know,
but
but
she's an outstanding person. I don't like her politics, but she's an outstanding person.
She can choose to believe that. But for most people, you know, who earn their success, that's really the core of it. That's really what being human is all about, is about striving and trying to earn your success. You know, look at sports. What's the purpose of sports? It's not just to see a round object thrown around a basketball court or a football or an oblong object on a football field, but it's to push each other to excel. We want to believe that when our team wins, it's because the other team was so good.
If the Cubs had a welfare check, it would have been longer than 1908 since we've won a championship. Listen, we're really out of time. I got to tell you,
well, it's been fun.
Doesn't surprise me.
Yeah.
Hey, not to slight people, Jasmine Valesco as well as Daniel Rowe are also big fans of yours, and do mention you, and I want to put them in there. I can't thank you enough, editor-in-chief of Breitbart.com, who is in from Santa Monica to visit his folks for Pesach. I want to wish you and your wife and your children and your future children all the success and wonderfulness in the world. Thank you, Sonny, for coming here doing Colomoid to help us film. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Stay tuned next week. I have no idea what's going to be on, but we'll figure it out at some point in time. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Joel. Be well. Bye-bye.
Thank you.